This is Melissa Torgerson. Leon, we can see that you're on. Can you enter your audio pin so that you can do the introductions? While Leon's putting in the pin, we want to let everyone know that the session is being recorded today.
You got me?
Yep. Good morning, Leon.
Okay. Good morning. Okay. As I guess I've been doing this for a while on these webinars, I want to welcome you on behalf of our office and appreciate that you're taking the time out from your busy schedule to listen and participate in this webinar. I think we're getting close now to where all of this is leading to the big to the brass ring, shall we say. Collecting the data, analyzing the data, though we probably can talk more about that, but how are you going to use this data to help you? If this data doesn't help you, why collect it besides us asking you to collect it? So I hope through this webinar and others, what you walk away with is an actual tool on as part of your program planning. So I'll leave it at that. And thank you again.
All right, then. So Dan Bausch and I today are going to be presenting, and during this webinar, if you want to go to the next slide, Dan, we're going to do a few things. First, we're going to talk very briefly about how the development of the LIHEAP model plan fits into the performance management cycle. We're going to talk about ways that the reports from the LIHEAP Data Warehouse can help you actually respond to specific questions in the model plan, and then we're going to take you into the Data Warehouse and show you where you can get those reports right after the webinar. And then we're going to also at the end outline additional performance management resources available to all of you to keep working on this. Next slide. So performance management, we've talked about this a lot. Performance management is the process of evaluating performance measurement data. And when we say performance measurement data, we're talking about the new LIHEAP performance measures, but we're also talking, as you'll see today, about all of the other reports that you submit, as well as information from your sub-grantees and your clients and your vendors. How do you use all of that information to make educated program decisions? And if you go to the next slide, you'll see that all of this happens in a cycle. And any of you who have been program directors, whether it's for LIHEAP or any other program, have seen some version of the cycle, many of you more times than you can count. The idea is that it doesn't stop with learning something once, adjusting your plan and adjusting the way you do business and then letting it go. It means that you're constantly evaluating and looking at how you could do things better and learning and then changing as you go along. And so if you go to the next slide, we're going to focus on the two quadrants of evaluation and planning. And so these are kinds of the key questions over this webinar and the next webinar that we're going to focus on, and that is the idea of doing this evaluative process where we're looking at what's happened in the past. We're going to look at what we actually did and see whether or not it matched your expectations or your goals. And the basic question is, are you accomplishing what you planned to accomplish? But also looking at changes. So we know, especially in energy, that something like the weather or fuel prices or the clientele or even the people who are offering our services or providing our services, all of those things can impact the way that people access our services and the way our services run. And so taking into account those changes, how does it impact what we can accomplish or what we want to accomplish? And then you take all of that information and you move to the next stage, which is, okay, we know what we've done. How does this change our goals and priorities? Do we have new ones? How can we make modifications to the program that will lead us where we want to go? And also, what are other states doing that might inform the way that we do business? And so all of these are kind of key questions that we're going to get to today and in other webinars moving forward. we chose to focus on the model plan for this webinar for a few reasons. First of all, the timing as well. I know many of you are beginning work or in the middle of work on your plans. But the model plan process, as many of you know, is more than simply writing down the responses in the OLDC. We know that it's a matter of looking back, talking with your partners and your providers and your vendors and clients to see what could we change this year, what can we change this year. For whatever reason, the state plan process brings out every advocate out of the woodwork who wants to know why you can't increase your income threshold, why we can't serve more clients, could we offer these kinds of services. And so it's definitely more than filling out the form. It's usually triggers policy discussions and new ideas, and so having data at your fingertips is really valuable. And we've listed 3 reasons here. I'm sure there are more, but first of all, being able to adjust responses in your LIHEAP model plan to reflect what is actually happening on the ground. We see a lot of states who kind of give the same generic answers every year in their LIHEAP model plan, and could go back and true up to make it more accurately reflect what's actually happening. But also to look at areas where changes in program design may be necessary to accomplish the goals. You know, you may be putting things in your plan because that really is your goal, as it should be. It's a priority for your department or your agency or your state. And so if you're not meeting those goals, what are some of the program changes you might want to consider to accomplish that? And then once again, being able to use data to work with stakeholders to look at policy questions. So when someone does ask why can't we increase our income threshold, or why can't we give bigger benefits or a different kind of benefit, to be able to have data to present to people to either justify your decision or even just to talk through what the options are is really helpful. So we're going to kind of address 3 areas, or we're going to try to in the hour that we have. The webinar slides address 3, and these are allocating funds by program component, determining income eligibility criteria, and prioritizing lowest income households. We are going to highlight a tutorial at the end of this webinar, and that will have additional examples, and we'll continue to add to that as time goes on. So we're going to start with this first topic area, model plan question 1.2. We've taken this right out of the plan. All of you are asked to estimate the percentage of LIHEAP funds that will be used for each program component. It's important to note that this is an estimate. So we know that many of you will put down your estimates and then go back into the plan to modify that if you end up spending funds differently. But we've also seen that there are many states that don't necessarily carry those changes forward to the following year, or change their estimates year to year. And so we're going to look at an example of how data might help you to do that. So if you go to the next slide, we think there are 3 main questions when you get to this part of your model plan that the data can help you answer. How's our state estimated funding allocations in previous model plans? How has our state actually used funding in previous years? And then how do those 2 align? And we think that'll tell you a lot. So we've given an example. In this example, the grantee has used the same funding allocation estimates in their model plan for several years. This is not unusual. Remember, we talked about the state plan being really a policy document that many people have a say in, and so people are a little hesitant to change their estimates around too much. And so we do see year to year a lot of folks who leave this static, and this is one example of a person or a plan that has done this since 2012. They've left the same estimates in their model plan. But when we go to the same grantees' actual uses, and this is from the data warehouse, you can see that there's variation from year to year. This is expected, right? We know that there are times when you don't spend all your money in one area. For example, ARA funds came along, I remember, and people couldn't spend all their weatherization money, and so that got moved to heating, or you had a particularly mild winter season, and so you spent more on cooling. And there are all kinds of contingencies that would allow these to fluctuate. But there are also patterns here that you can see where you're spending the bulk of funding, obviously here in cooling and less in heating. So when we go to compare the estimates with these actual uses, you can see a pretty dramatic difference. So for example, they're actually estimating that they're going to spend most of their money in heating, but each year it's been flip-flopped. They've actually spent most of their money in cooling. Now, does this mean they're going to go back in and change their plan? Well, this gives them certainly the case they need to go in and update it to be a little bit more true to what they're spending. Once again, we understand those are estimates, but the data would suggest that cooling is where they spend the bulk of their funds. And so if we go to the next slide, the questions that you ask yourself, so if all of you were to go out today and look at what you've estimated over the last, even just your last 2 years, and then look at your uses of funds, which is what Dan's going to show you how to do, the question that you ask when you put those two side by side is, does your state need to adjust or true up your estimates in the LIHEAP model plan to more closely reflect those uses of funds? Or, if the funding allocation estimates in your model plan reflect your priorities or goals, does your state actually need to look at your program delivery or budgeting to get closer to those estimates? So just because your uses are different doesn't automatically mean you need to go in and change your state plan. It actually could mean that your design or program of your program is not allowing you to get to what you want to be doing, which are the numbers in your plan. So I'm going to turn it over to Dan.
Thank you, Melissa. So there's two types of data that you can use to look at how you've estimated your allocations and to look at how you used your funds in the past. The estimated allocations, as Melissa said, are in your LIHEAP model plans in question 1.2. And you can access your model plans in OLDC, or you can access recent model plans for your state and for other states through the LIHEAP clearinghouse. And past uses of funds are reported every year on your LIHEAP performance data form on the grantee survey, and that data is taken and put into the data warehouse so you can use it to make charts and to conduct analyses. So now I'm going to take you into the data warehouse and show you how to produce a similar chart to the one Melissa showed previously. So the data warehouse is found on the LIHEAP Performance Management website under the Data Warehouse tab on the main home page. And we're going to focus on the guided search tool, which is the second one down. So to access this, you click Access the Guided Search, and you're able to use this tool to look at charts and build tables for your state, to build charts and tables that allow you to compare multiple states, or to look at statistics for the entire nation. So we're going to look at a single state report example. You can see there's different menu options. We're interested in how funds are used, so I'm going to click on how funds are used. And there's a number of reports that are available for you, and for each one, if you hover over it, you can see a description of what that report will provide for you. And we're going to look at grantee uses of LIHEAP program funds over time, this second report. So the first thing you're asked to do is select a state. And I'm going to pick Colorado here. And then you're asked to choose the years that you're interested in looking at and including in a charter table. So for this example, we'll look at 2010 to 2014. Then you click View Report, and the data warehouse produces a chart similar to the one Melissa showed previously that's showing the uses of LIHEAP funds for Colorado from 2010 to 2014. One note on the years in the data warehouse. Right now, the most recent publicly available data is for 2014, but if you're logged into the performance management website with your grantee username, you can also see your own state's data for fiscal year 2015 and include that in your charts and tables. So in this example, you can see how funding has changed over time by looking at the size of each of the bars. But if you also hover over components in the bars, you can see the proportion that they make up for that year. So for example, the funding that was used for heating assistance benefits is in blue. And if you hover over it, you can see that in 2010, 58% of the funds that Colorado used were for heating assistance. If you hover over 2011 over the heating assistance portion of the bar, you can see it's about the same, 59%. But then beginning in 2012, you can see the portion of funds they allocated and used for heating assistance increased up above 70%, 76% there. Below all the charts that you generate in the guided search, you get some descriptive text, and you get a table that has all the data that was used to create the chart, and you can export that data to Excel and use it for your own purposes. So a chart like this can assist you with program planning as you see how funds are used for different LIHEAP components, how that's changed over time, and how you might decide to allocate your funds in the future to help meet your programmatic goals. So I will turn it over back to Melissa.
I think we're going to take questions at this point. So if anyone has questions, we'll take that before moving on to the next example. Though, let me explain this. Most of you have seen the slide. If you haven't, though, there's a few ways to ask questions. You can raise your hand. So you can see that the little hand that you can raise on your menu bar. You can also type in a question, and Michelle will read it. And then if you've entered your audio pin, we can unmute you so that you can ask a question.
Okay, so we do have a few typed in questions. The first is, are we able to print out the slides? So yes, the slides were sent with the reminder email that was sent out yesterday, but additionally after the webinar, the slides will be posted. So just so everyone's aware of that at the beginning of the webinar. And the next typed in question is there a way to see how other states plan to use and report on their Assurance 16 funds?
Dan, would you like to
Yes.
take the issue? Okay.
Yeah. You can access state plans, state model plans through the LIHEAP clearinghouse, and you can find plans for all state grantees, and within the model plans, grantees are asked about their Assurance 16 funds and how they intend to use them. Also, a prize conducted a special study of Assurance 16 programs that states are running, and that is now in final review by OCS, and it's going to be published as part of the 2015 report to Congress and Home Energy Notebook. And also there's a session at the upcoming 2017 NUAC conference that's going to discuss Assurance 16 programs.
And there's data on the data warehouse as well on how states have used Assurance 16 in terms of as a proportion of their funding. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay.
And we have another typed in question that reads, will the LIHEAP data for tribal grantees be available in the future?
At this time, the only available data in the data warehouse is for state grantees and the District of Columbia. Tribal data may be available at some point in the future. Right now it's not available, and there aren't any upcoming plans to put it in the data warehouse that are concrete. But
And we also have a call-in question from Kathy Kinch. So Kathy, I'm going to unmute you now. You should be unmuted now, Kathy.
Thank you. So my question is, the last example of the report that we looked at to show historical usage or allocation of funds to different program components, I may have missed it, but where on that slide, or did it reference, was the source for that data the state's model plan or the grantee survey?
It's the grantee survey. So the uses of funds are actual, so they're taken from the grantee survey.
Okay.
And then,
okay.
yeah, and what we're recommending is that you go and compare those to the estimates in your model plan to see if they're aligned.
Okay. I have been, so this is Kathy still, but there have been times when we have, the state of Maine has applied for and received approval for the weatherization waiver, so where we have increased or changed our allocation and put, say, the 25% towards weatherization. And when I spoke with our liaison the last time we did this, and I was told not to change the state plan to reflect that. So what I'm hearing today is that your prize is recommending that if we get into the program year and our actual is significantly different than what we estimated in our state plan, that I'm hearing that we should go in and make those adjustments to our state plan that had already been approved on an estimated basis?
That is in the last two trainings, national and regional, that is the advice that OCS has given, is that people should be going back in and adjusting that.
Okay, thank you for that clarification.
Thanks for your question, Kathy. I'm going to mute you again.
Are we ready to move on?
We also just had a note from Travis McAdam at the Clearinghouse, and he just wanted to let everybody know that the Clearinghouse has a table of how states plan to use their Assurance 16 funds in their fiscal year 17 plans. So just so everyone's aware of that. And we do have another call-in question from Jean Amison. So Jean, I'm going to unmute you now. And you should be unmuted, Jean.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. I just had a quick question that I wanted to ask. I know that OCS would prefer us to amend our state plans as things drastically change, but is it required for us to do that here in Florida? Would require a pretty extensive routing process, and so I'm not necessarily sure it's worth the administrative time that it would take. So I just want to know how hard and set they are on that guidance.
So
this is David Carroll. That guidance is under discussion. So what's very clear is if you've made a basic change in the way that you're approaching your if you've made a basic change in the way that you're approaching your program, where you really need to just clarify what's going on, that seems like it's okay to go ahead and do that without extensive review. However, this very question that you're talking about, Jean, where you get into the middle of a program year and you find that you have a need to change things, one of the topics at the national training is going to be the discussion of how, and this is going to be an interactive discussion with grantees, it's going to be how to write your plan in a way that you can adapt to contingencies. So, Jean, what I'm assuming is that in some cases you're finding that fewer people apply or more people apply, there's less use for crisis, there's more use for heating systems, something like that. Is that what you're talking about?
Well, yes. I mean, we don't have a big variance during the year, but I was just curious, how hard and set HH was. HHS was may not require a lot of administrative tasks on their end, or they think it may not require a full routing. It's just internal procedures that we have to follow before we can submit anything to the Fed.
We've heard Lauren talk about this, and she's really talking about is if you decide to change from, as Kathy just said, let's say that in the middle of the year you decided to suddenly put an extra 10% of your funds, go from 15% to 25% into weatherization instead of using it for heating or crisis. Lauren has said, well, it seems that some public participation would be appropriate for making that kind of a decision. Leon, do you want to speak to that just for a minute? Michelle, can you unmute Leon?
Sure. Leon, you should be unmuted now.
Okay. No, David, I can't add anything more. But what I'm trying to do is, while you're talking, is I want to go into the statute to see if there's anything that this statute refers to in terms of amending a plan. So if I do, I'll raise my hand, okay?
But again, what Lauren has suggested is that, yes, it is important. It's important to have a state plan that is consistent with what you actually did during that program year. If there's a clarification, then that seems pretty straightforward and might not require such extensive public procedures. But as as Lauren was saying, is and this is something that maybe Melissa was getting at in the whole discussion. If you find that you're consistently having to change how you spend your funds from what the state plan says, then probably it makes sense to build in the contingency. And Melissa, there is going to be a session at the national training about talking about how to do that.
Yes, so using several different scenarios. So yes, but David, that's exactly what we're getting at. Is that there are two pieces. A lot of people go back in and amend their state plans throughout the year to better reflect what's happening. But what we're that doesn't mean they carry that forward into the next year. And so what this is really getting at is, if you know, in the example we showed, you saw that the heating and cooling percentages were swapped since 2012, and so it doesn't make more sense for this state to consider changing that in their estimates so that perhaps they aren't having to go back in and amend it halfway through the year. So that's kind of what this was getting at.
Okay, great. So thanks for your question, Jean. I'm going to mute you again. And Melissa, that looks like all the questions we have for now.
Okay. So this next topic is one that I remember very distinctly as a state coordinator, and I've heard from others that any time the state plan window is open, this is when you have a lot of people coming forward and asking, why is our maximum income guideline so high, or why is it so low? And so this is the next question we're going to get into. In the state plan, you're asked for each program component to designate a maximum income threshold. And so this is an example of the piece. And so when you get to that, some of the evaluation questions you should be asking are looking at how your federally income eligible population has changed over recent years. That's an important baseline for how you look at your data. And then how does your designated state income threshold impact the population eligible for assistance? So for example, if your maximum income threshold is lower than the federal one, you're essentially limiting the amount of people that can apply for LIHEAP. And then what portion of income eligible households are you serving each year? So we're going to walk through this a little bit. I've actually put two examples on these slides. You can see this is just looking at federal guidelines, the number of eligible households. And in example A, you see that income eligible households have actually decreased over the last 3 years versus in example B, where you've seen a gradual increase between 2011 and 2015. If you go to the next slide, the question is, how does the state income threshold impact the size of the population eligible for assistance? So in example A, the state income maximum income threshold or eligibility requirement is the same as the federal. So you see the same amount of households, the maximum amount of households eligible for LIHEAP assistance. But in example B, the grantee has said, you know what, we're going to tighten up our state maximum income eligibility requirement, and in doing so we've reduced the amount of our income eligible population by 50%. And so you can see that really clearly, that they have decided to basically reduce the pool of people that can apply for LIHEAP. And then when you take this and you look at the amount of households you serve, you see something unique happen. The grantee in example A serves 14 to 19% of LIHEAP income eligible households each year, and that's because their eligibility requirement is set at the maximum. Because example B has kind of reduced or shrunk the pool of people that are income eligible for LIHEAP, they can say that they serve over 35% of income eligible households each year. So what does this mean for you? When you look at this data, what could you be thinking? Well, it makes sense to look at other states around you to find out, you know, if you've got, I'll never forget the last year I was doing LIHEAP, we had someone who continued to say that we needed to lower our maximum guideline. And so talking to people in your region to find out how they got to that, or what they are learning or what they're experiencing, is helpful. And finding, also being able to just show someone in a policy meeting or in an advocate meeting or utility what the other states around you are doing. And in this example, I pulled all the Northwest states, some of the Northwest states. You can see that Washington has opted to use a lower state income maximum income guideline. And so in this case, you know, if Montana or Alaska or Idaho or Oregon were, you know, looking at the possibility of lowering that, they could turn to Cecil in Washington, no pressure on Cecil, and ask him, you know, how did you get to that decision? How does it impact the people you're serving or your design? Would you make this choice again? And so on. And so when you look at all this data together, so what? What should you be asking yourself? And the first question is, if your state can only serve a small percentage of the income eligible population, should you consider lowering your state income eligibility threshold to reduce the number of households who can apply for LIHEAP? There are a lot of implications with that, and we're not suggesting that this question is a simple, straightforward question, but there are a lot of sub-grantees, for example, that will say, you know, we have to turn a lot of people away. And so does it make sense to perhaps target LIHEAP to a smaller portion of the population so people aren't applying and then being turned down for assistance? On the flip side, if your state income eligibility is already lower or you're considering lowering it, are there specific groups of people who may be falling through the cracks at higher income levels? We know from experience that energy burden is not just the result of low income, it is also the result of high energy costs or poor housing stock that leads to high energy consumption or cost, or fuel price spikes. And so if there aren't other resources available to help people with their energy bill, and you've limited LIHEAP to the very lowest income, are you going to be missing a significant portion of your population that really might need assistance? And then how do our maximum income guidelines compare to other states? And that's that chart that we just showed you. Once again, when you have a bunch of people in a room, and I've heard this story over and over again, saying, well, we know of 18 other states that do this, to be able to show people the data that say, look, you know, we're right on par with all of the other states in our region, or we're not on par with all the other states in our region, and it's helpful to guide the conversation, or at least lend to the conversation. So I'm going to turn it over to Dan, who's going to get into the data warehouse.
So what data can you use to look and to examine this further? The first is income eligible population data. That is produced every year for the annual LIHEAP Home Energy Notebook. and it provides state-level estimates of the number of income-eligible households generated using census data. That's available in the data warehouse. Every year in your LIHEAP household report, you report on the number of households served for different types of assistance, and that's available in the data warehouse. And then on your annual grantee survey in the LIHEAP performance data form, you report the maximum income for a 4-person household for the fiscal year. So now we're going to go back into the data warehouse to show you how to get some of these examples. So the first thing I'm going to show you, the first chart, is we're going to look at the number of households that are income eligible. So we want to look at who is eligible for assistance in this first tab. As the pop-up description tells us for the second report, this report will give us a bar chart that shows us the number of income eligible households using the federal guidelines and using the state income guidelines. For this example, I'll choose the state of Iowa, and we'll look at the most recent 4 years, 2011 to 2014. And this produces a chart for us that, again, compares the number of federally income eligible households and shows us the number of state income eligible households from 2011 to 2014 for Iowa. And you can see how those have changed over time. But what if you wanted to produce the same example that Melissa discussed earlier, where it was this chart, but it also included the number of households served? Well, the data warehouse lets you customize reports like this by going to the top left of the chart and clicking on Customize Report. It takes you to a different screen that lets you navigate through different data items that are available, so you can add them to your chart or remove data elements or change the state or change the period of years you want to look at. So to do the same example that was in the PowerPoint, we're interested in getting the total households served. So we first want to find the kind of data we want, which is LIHEAP recipients. And then we want to select a data category. Since we're interested in anyone who got assistance, we'll go to total, any type of assistance. And we'll select total households served, the first field. And then you're able to, as I mentioned, change other things. We're going to want to look at multiple bars. And then this last box on the right-hand side allows you to edit the title or description to better explain what's in your chart or in your table. So when I click Create Your Data Report, now we have the chart. And you can see that total households served has been added to the chart in green. One interesting feature of the data warehouse is these charts are dynamic, and you can turn elements on and off. So if you wanted to just look at the number of state income eligible households compared to the households served, you could click the federally income households off, and the chart would adjust and show you a new chart, and you can turn it back on as well. So Melissa also showed a chart that showed the state maximum income amounts for heating assistance for several states. And you can also find that information by going to LIHEAP income eligible population, then clicking state guidelines in the select a data category box. And then scrolling down, you can see fields for all the state maximum income guidelines for each type of LIHEAP assistance. And you can produce a similar chart by selecting the states you might be interested in looking at. So now we're going to go back and open it up for questions. So Michelle can check if anyone has any questions.
Doesn't look like we have any questions right now, Dan.
Okay.
Oh, wait, one question just came in. I had a question about using eligibility criteria to limit the distribution of benefits.
So let me, I'm going to take a guess at what that means. As we showed, obviously you can limit the number of people who can apply for LIHEAP by setting a lower maximum income guideline. And because you can set different guidelines for each program component, you could potentially say limit your crisis assistance to the, a lower income population, while you leave your heating assistance, at a higher threshold, so more people can apply. Is that kind of what? I don't know if that's what the user was referring to.
And we have a question from Donna Forrest, who raised her hand, and that's who typed in the question. So, Donna, I'm going to unmute you, but first you have to enter your audio PIN. All right, Donna, well, it looks like we're having issues getting you your PIN. So if Melissa didn't fully answer your question or all the areas that you wanted answered, please feel free to type in a more in-depth question, and we'll be happy to answer it for you.
Okay. So the next and the final example that we have for you is about prioritizing the lowest income households. And there are a number of areas across the plan where it asks you who you're targeting or prioritizing. And we're going to focus on the lowest income households today because we know that the LIHEAP statute talks about targeting benefits to the lowest income households with the highest energy costs. And so that's what we're going to focus on today. But really, many of the charts and graphs that you are seeing here today could also be generated to look at, say, vulnerable populations and the same questions that we're asking. So if you go to the next slide, the questions that we're going to answer with data today are what's the distribution of income eligible households across poverty intervals, and how has this changed over time? What portion of assisted households have income in the lowest poverty intervals? And does the distribution of households among poverty intervals vary by program component? So we're going to look at these three questions with data. So this chart is looking at income eligible households. So these are all of the households in your region or state that are eligible for LIHEAP based on federal income guidelines. And they've been split down into poverty intervals so that you can see of your eligible population what portion is in that lowest income category. So that's at or below 100% of poverty. And in this case, for this grantee, you can see a couple things from this table. First, you can see that that top blue portion, which is those at or below 100%, has grown slightly over the last 5 years. And in 2015, 27% of households were at or below 100% of poverty. On the next slide, we're going to look at assisted households. And it's a busy slide, but the point here is that if your goal is to reach the lowest income households and you want to see that you're effectively doing outreach or targeting or whatever, then you should be seeing the percentage of assisted households at that income level at minimum mirror the percentage of eligible households. So for example, in this example, you'll see that people assisted with heating assistance, almost 40% were at or below 100% of poverty. And since it's greater than the 27% of people who are actually eligible, who also fell at or below, we can assume that this grantee is effectively reaching low-income households with heating assistance. And so it's that idea of, and the gray box is really kind of that idea to look at in your data. If you see that the percentage of income eligible households at or below 100% of federal poverty level is 25%, then when you look at your income or your assisted households, you should be able to see that same 25% assisted in that income level. And if you're not, that means that you're not necessarily reaching the lowest income folks in your region. It's also important to look at distribution of poverty intervals, households among poverty intervals by program component. So in this example, you'll see that the heating assistance, like we said before, there's 40% of the people receiving heating assistance were at or below 100% of poverty. But when you go over to crisis assistance, it's a much bigger proportion of people with the lowest income. And what this suggests, just from looking at the data without even looking at the state plan, is that one of two things. Either the state has intentionally targeted the lowest income households with their crisis assistance program, or that you have a higher percentage of lower income households seeking crisis assistance. And in either way, it gives you some idea of whether, number one, you're intentionally targeting and it's working, or if perhaps your program or lower income people or lowest income people are accessing or needing crisis assistance, and whether you could be targeting them for prevention in other ways. So the questions you'd want to ask yourself: do we need to adjust our targets based on income eligible population changes? So if we see that we've had huge increases or even just increases in the proportion of eligible households that are in that lowest poverty interval, do we need to be adjusting our targets so that we're reaching those folks first? How do we adjust our outreach activities? And this is actually a part of your model plan to improve our targeting results. If you were to get in and see that you are not reaching those lowest income households at the same level you're seeing them occur in the eligible population, what are some things you could be doing to better reach them? And this is the same thing with vulnerable households as well. Are we intending to serve different groups with particular program components? So if this particular grantee had said in their state plan that their goal was to prioritize crisis assistance to the lowest income households, this data would suggest that they're successfully doing that. If that was not their intention, then it may be worthwhile to explore using other program components or other services to address crises among the lowest income households in their region. So Dan's going to jump into the data.
So the data you can use to try to understand how you're prioritizing the lowest income households includes the income eligible population by poverty interval, which is again included in the LIHEAP Home Energy Notebook and produced for that and is available in the data warehouse. And also the number of households that you served by poverty interval, which is reported in Section 2 of the LIHEAP Household Report. So I'm going to take you back to the data warehouse. We're going to look at two examples. The first example we're going to look at is the first chart that Melissa showed you, which was the breakdown of the federally income eligible population by poverty interval. So since we're trying to understand the eligible population, we're going to go to who is eligible for assistance on the guided search. And we're going to look at the fifth one down, federally income eligible households by percent of poverty guideline. For this example, we'll look at Alabama, and we'll look at the period from 2008 to 2014. So the data warehouse produces a chart here that has one bar for every year, and it's a stacked bar that shows you the whole federally income eligible population broken down by each of the poverty intervals. And you can see that that for Alabama, it's been relatively consistent over time, but there has been changes. You can see in 2012, the portion of the federally income eligible population that was greater than 50% of poverty was about 17%. And then in 2014, that declined to 11%. And the portion that was below 100% poverty in 2012 was 49%, and that increased up to 53% in 2014. I'm going to show you one more example. And this time we're going to look at households served by poverty interval. So we're interested in who is getting assisted. For this example, we're going to look at a pie chart, and we're going to look at households that are receiving heating assistance by percent of HHS poverty guidelines for the latest year available. We're going to again look at Alabama, and we're going to look at the most recent year, 2014. Now you get a pie chart showing you the breakdown by percent of by poverty interval for their heating assistance recipient households in fiscal year 2014. You can see that in 2014, just about 43% of their heating assistance households were below 75% of poverty, and another about 31% were between 75% and 100% of poverty. So if you add those together, that's almost 75% of the households that Alabama provided heating assistance to were below poverty. And if you remember in the prior chart I showed you, 53% of Alabama's federally income eligible population were below 100% of poverty. And that would indicate that they're serving that group of households that is below 100% of poverty at a higher rate relative to the proportion in the eligible population. And again, all the information is put into a table below the chart, and you can export it to use it and combine it with other data. So now we'll go back, and I think at this point we should go to the final slides on resources, and then have some questions at the end.
I agree.
So we've been working on putting together resources to help you to be able to use the data warehouse and to find the information that you're looking for. So one of those resources is a new data warehouse tutorial, and this is a document, a PDF document that provides step-by-step instructions for using the data warehouse. It provides information about what is in the data warehouse, and it also provides some examples that we didn't show you in this presentation, such as looking at vulnerable households, looking at combination charts where you look at households served and funding. And that tutorial can be found by going to this link at the bottom of the slides, and it's also available under the Resources tab on the Data Warehouse. And I will hand it back over to Melissa.
Okay, great. So some of you I know are sitting and saying, we just turned in a bunch of performance measure data, and we didn't cover that in this webinar. This webinar was, we wanted to focus on existing reports. But at the end of this month, we have tentatively scheduled a webinar to begin digging into how to use that performance measurement data in combination with all of this other data that you're already collecting or have collected in the past. So we do have this tentatively scheduled, and I want to point out, we have it in red here, that if you are planning on attending the April National Training in New Orleans, we'd really like you to be, or your staff, on this particular webinar. We're going to be going over a tool that's currently being developed by the Performance Management Implementation Work Group that allows you to look at different scenarios and look at your data more closely. And that tool will be used in New Orleans at the National Training, where we'll also be spending time on using that data you've been collecting to make program decisions. So we understand that that's something that we all need help interpreting and analyzing and then using, and Apprise is preparing training materials for that. On the next slide, we've listed out some different performance management resources here. You have the website, which Dan was going back and forth to, and part of that includes the resources and tutorial tab for the data warehouse. And some of this is currently under development and being more developed, so as we update the versions, we're updating it on the website. We also have listed here the virtual library, which many of you saw last year's regional trainings. We pointed that out. The LIHEAP Clearinghouse, as you saw, is a source for state plans, but Travis mentioned there's Assurance 16 charts, and you can look at different ways people are using their money and providing services. And then the training resources website actually has a great video webinar on working on your model plan, as well as other resources for other program components. And then we've listed our names and contact information. If you would like to ask more questions, need help using the data warehouse, or just using data to think about your program, you can contact any of us. I think we're going to open it up for questions now.
And just to clarify on Donna's question earlier, Melissa, the question was about using eligibility criteria to limit the distribution of benefits, and Donna's question in particular was, can't you use these numbers to show an increased capacity?
Dan, do you have an answer to that?
No, I don't. You'd be able to use the numbers to see a number of things about who you're serving and how that has changed over time. So I would think that would speak to what Donna is trying to get at, but I'm not exactly sure.
Donna, if you want to talk offline, we can go into more detail about your question and maybe even go in and look at your state data with you and talk through it.
And we do have another question that was typed in. It reads, many of my low-income households are renters who have heat included in rent. How can I tell what share of my lowest income households are renters with heat and rent, and how that affects the rate at which I serve them?
There are not any data on heat and rent at this time that are included in the data warehouse or that are available, but we're working right now on guidance related to heat and rent households and in discussions about that, and should have something later in the fiscal year about guidance for addressing heat and rent.
And I'm going to add to that it's there are lots of folks that have unique pieces of their program that you all have data on, but that may not be in this kind of national data warehouse. And so that's a powerful question, because many of you have situations like that, or perhaps you have fuel funds where you're serving a portion of the population with fuel funds, so you're using your LIHEAP to prioritize other income categories. And there are 1,000,001 different reasons you're going to see different numbers pop up. And so if you need assistance helping to reconcile your local data, and I say local meaning your state data that you may be holding on to, with what you're seeing in this data warehouse, that's something that we can help you with, to kind of look at that and compare and help you figure out what that story is and what you can do with that data.
And we also have another typed in question that reads, when will fiscal year 2016 data be available?
As I mentioned earlier, right now in the data warehouse, the most recent data are for 2014, which are the most recently published data. And if you sign in or if you log in using your grantee username to the performance management website, you can see data for your own state for 2015 that you provided. That 2015 report to Congress is going through the review process, and once that is published, the 2015 data become available publicly. The 2016 data that you submitted recently through your household report and through your performance data form, once those have been reviewed and once those have been put together and gone through the process, it would be a similar order of sequence where those data would be available for your state for you to use and see in the data warehouse, and then it would become publicly available once the 2016 report to Congress is published.
This is David Carroll. The 2016 data will be available for your use in the data warehouse no later than June 30th. We're hoping it'll be before that, but we just have to walk through the process of verifying everybody's data, making sure they're all consistent. But we can guarantee you that they will be in the data warehouse no later than June 30th.
Are there any more questions?
Nope, it doesn't look like we have any additional questions at this time.
Right, well, as you get in the data warehouse and you start trying to pull up reports and you run into questions or issues, please feel free to contact any one of us, and we will walk through that with you or give you the answer you're needing, hopefully. Thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to the next webinar, which is tentatively scheduled for March 22nd. Have a great week.